Data and story need to be intertwined. It needs to be tucked and folded together. Data on its own simply won't tell a story. Data is not a story. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about two of my favorite subjects, storytelling and data. Though I have to be honest, if you looked at the grades in my statistics classes in college, you might be surprised that I do love data. But since this is a storytelling conference, what I would like to start off with is actually telling you a story. This came from my time at Lutheran Braille Workers. I was the president of Lutheran Braille Workers, which is the world's largest provider of free Braille and large print Christian materials, especially Bibles. One day I was in my office and a phone rang, and it was a lady, a mother, who wanted to share the story of her daughter, Samantha, 10-year-old girl. You see, Samantha had been born blind. And this was a very devout family, and they would go to church every Sunday. And growing up, all Samantha wanted to do was, whether it was at church or whether it was in Sunday school, one of the things she missed was she wanted to be able to read the Bible passages to the other kids instead of always having to have them read to her. And so she asked her mom, "Mom, can I please get a Braille Bible?" And so her mom went online. And when she looked to see what it would take to purchase one, what she found out is that the starting cost to purchase an English Braille Bible is over $800 for one Bible. And oftentimes that cost can actually extend over $2,000. And that was something the family just couldn't afford. And so as they continued on looking, one day they were connected with Lutheran Braille Workers, and they ordered this Bible, being told it was free, but not quite sure what was going to happen. And a few weeks later in the mail, this box arrived, and they opened it up, and inside were 4 books, and it was the Gospels in Braille. And you might wonder, what do you mean, 4 books, the Gospels? Well, most people also don't realize that one Braille Bible is actually made up of 37 volumes. It is over 5.5 feet in shelf space. And so for Samantha, though, those books, it was like Christmas Day. And even more incredible is that week was Easter. And so that Sunday, she got to take her books of the Bible to Sunday school, and for the first time in her life, she was able to read the Easter story to the other kids. And at church, she was able to follow along with the pastor. And when they got in the car, Samantha's mother realized she was so excited. She was bouncing in the back seat. And so she asked her, what was so exciting about today? And Samantha said, "Oh, Mama, for all of these years, whenever pastor would talk about the tomb and whenever I heard the story, I always thought that Easter was for everybody but me. I never understood what they were talking about. But today, when I got to read the story, when I got to read about how Jesus died and he rose from the grave, I realized he did it for me too. Oh, Mama, isn't Easter amazing?" Now, I share that story because within that story, there's a couple of data points that make that story so much more powerful. Does anybody remember one of the data points I shared? $800 for a Bible. I heard an audible gasp from the audience, right? Caught you off guard. How many of us imagine ever having to go to the Christian bookstore and spending $800 for a Bible, right? What was the other data point I shared? They're big. 37 volumes, 5.5 feet of shelf space. It's hard to wrap our mind around the size of a Bible of that nature. But ultimately, though, what are you likely to remember from that story? changed a life. It's what she wanted. She realized Easter was for her too. Can you imagine being 10 years old and thinking that Easter was for everybody else except for you? But within that story, and I've actually tested that story when I was at LBW, when I tested that story, what I actually found is that if I wasn't including those data points, it just simply wasn't as compelling. It's still a powerful story. A young girl doesn't have a Bible. She gets a Bible. She learns Easter for her. It's still so special. But what makes that story so compelling is the challenge the family faced in identifying how are they going to be able to afford a Bible. And then the imagination of a Bible that's actually taller than Samantha if it was stacked on the ground. And so the point of that story isn't to make people cry, but rather to share that when data is most effectively told, it's what we call being tucked and folded into that story. And part of the reason that is so critical is because data on its own is often not remembered. Stanford Graduate School, a business, they did a study. They found that stories are 22 times more likely to be remembered than data on its own. But that doesn't mean data isn't important. In fact, if you tuck and fold data into that story, it's likely to be remembered. In fact, I would wager that when you go home, if you remember that story of Samantha, one of the things you're going to remember, though, is $800 for one Bible. And I learned this the hard way, sharing a little bit about my journey. I started in the fundraising world at a small Christian college in Selma, Alabama, Concordia College. And when I was trained, when I was taught, I was told that to be effective, you have to go out and you have to tell stories. And let me tell you, at that college, we had some of the most incredible stories you would ever believe. Powerful stories would have audiences crying. And I would go out and I would share those stories, and yet when I would ask for support, I would get some, but I really wasn't getting a lot. It wasn't effective. And I was frustrated. I was trying to figure out. I was told, tell stories, you'll raise money. And I was telling stories, and I just wasn't raising that much money. And then one day I had a gentleman come up to me. His name is Kermit. I will never forget Kermit. He came up and he asked me 3 questions. And let me tell you, the way it started, though, was, well, Daniel, can I ask you a question? Which, as a presenter, you never like that question being phrased that way, let me tell you. But the first question he asked was, so what? Literally, that's what he asked me. So what? You told these beautiful stories. They're great, but so what? Then the second question he asked is, what am I supposed to do with that? And I'm sitting there in my mind screaming, I told you what to do with it. I asked you for money. But he hadn't made that connection. And the third question he asked was, how do I know that this is actually more than just an anecdotal story? How do I know there's a greater impact? And I walked away from that presentation, and I walked away from that conversation with Kermit, and I was asking myself, what am I missing? How did Kermit come up and ask those questions that I didn't know how to answer in terms of building it into the presentation? And then a few weeks later, it was actually literally a few weeks later, I had this company come on campus called StoryFind, because they were filming our campaign video and they were doing a recruitment video for our college. And I met Mike and I met Kristen, owners of StoryFind. And it was through the process of developing the story that Kristen actually taught me about Aristotle's, and we'll talk about it in a second, Paul's rhetorical triangle. And I can explain it, but even though Kristen cannot be here, this is one of her favorite subjects to talk about. So she actually recorded a video in which she'll explain Aristotle's rhetorical triangle a little bit better.
Hi, everyone. I am so sad that I am not there with you in person at DMC today. but I have full confidence that Daniel is going to do an amazing job teaching you everything that you may need to know about using data to tell your story. And I did just want to jump on and do a little part of this presentation for you because this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So this is Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, but since it's a ministry conference and I'm kind of a nerd, I wanted to call it Paul's rhetorical triangle because the Apostle Paul was an amazingly persuasive communicator. So I want to throw some credit his way today. The Greek philosopher Aristotle was born actually like 300 years before Paul, and his work was still highly relevant in Paul's time. So we'll just call it Paul's rhetorical triangle for our purposes today. So here's the thing. If we were only sharing stories for the sake of entertainment, we could totally skip this section of the presentation. But the reality is, if you're sharing a story, you also want your audience to act on what they're experiencing, right? We're not just telling stories to entertain. So here's the bottom line. Aristotle teaches us that if we can connect with a person's heart, their head, and their need for credibility or trust, we are much more likely to persuade them to action. So everyone do this with me. Daniel, you can demonstrate from the stage. There are 3 parts of the triangle, okay? There's ethos, logos, and pathos. We are going to work through each of these corners together, and we'll talk about what they mean for storytelling. They are essentially the ingredients for storytelling success, the perfect recipe for moving your audience to action. So for ethos, think of the word ethics. This is the corner of the triangle that deals with your organization's credibility. Simply put, people will support you only if they trust you. So how do we create trust with a story? You can share the backstory of your organization. You can use real people in your stories to demonstrate results. Your audience needs to know you are who you say you are. Be transparent and be authentic. You won't be for everyone, and that's okay. Make sure you know the audience. We're going to do this in a little bit. Daniel will do this with you, but make sure you know who the audience is that you want to reach. And then tell stories that will reach them. So ethos, that's first. Next up is pathos. I can just picture Paul thinking about each corner of these triangles. Pathos, it's a very important corner of the triangle. Pathos is where emotional connection happens. So American businessman Peter Guber, he's the author of the book Tell to Win. He says, if you miss your audience's heart, the only wallet that gets hit will be your own. Your stories have to connect with the emotional centers of your audience's brains. I think we can all agree with this, right? Science teaches us that the decisions we thought were logical are actually made based on emotions instead. If your story makes a deep heart connection with the viewer, you will be much more likely to persuade them to action. But here's the piece that we often miss in our storytelling. Logos. Logos, that's data. It's the logical reasoning that has to be present in your stories to move your audience to act. This is where data and storytelling come together. If you can sprinkle in a stat that supports the heart of your story, you're golden. The perfect recipe: trust, heart, and logic. Aristotle or Paul's rhetorical triangle. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day today.
Again, rhetorical triangle. Going back to the question I asked myself after Kermit approached me, what was I missing? I was missing the data. And yes, while decisions are often made through the heart, decisions are so often made emotionally, there still has to be a connection to the brain. The brain still has to sign off going, okay, that makes sense. I get it. The data is what provides that credibility with ethos, and it's what connects the brain to the heart. In addition, data, when done well, is often what leads to the compelling call to action. Because the data point is usually what is the problem we're trying to solve. Go back to Samantha's story, right? It's $800 for a Bible. An organization will give it for free. How do I support giving away more Braille Bibles for free to children like Samantha? I have another example, a very quick 2-minute video that really demonstrates Paul's rhetorical triangle very effectively.
Hi, my name is Scott. I think we may be able to help you. I met a man named Harris. He was suffocating to death with a benign tumor. I got to see Harris's transformation because of an amazing surgeon named Dr. Gary Parker.
So we've got to get your blood nice and strong for an operation, huh?
Dr. Gary had moved his entire family on the ship to volunteer for a short time. That was 29 years ago. He just never left. I'd never met anyone with that kind of dedication before.
Very happy we can schedule, and you'll spend Christmas here. First good Christmas in 13 years.
A couple weeks later, I got to take Harris back home to his village with an entirely new face, ready to start a new life.
The uniform that's put on people when you have these terrible deformities is you're rubbish, you're worthless, you're spiritually cursed, and when you can change the uniform, it's huge. And the person starts to imagine that they might not be rubbish after all. No one in our world is rubbish.
There was one day when more than 5,000 sick people came to see our doctors. Some of them had walked for more than a month. But there were too many of them, and we just didn't have enough doctors. I remember holding my camera, crying. We had to turn thousands away.
Three parts of the triangle. We have the credibility of surgeons and doctors sharing their experiences. We had heartfelt story of lives being changed. But it was the data at the end that really hit, doesn't it? 5,000 people showed up. Some walked for over a month to be there. And they had to turn away thousands. The data is what leads to that call to action. Now, I have this great image. I want to shout out Aaron. Where's Aaron? Aaron Pendleton. There we go, Aaron. Last November, he shared this with me, and I just about jumped out of my chair at lunch, and I was like, you've got to share this with me. I love it. But the most effective way to communicate data is you take any type of data, raw data. There's different ways to organize it. You can sort it. You can make it look pretty. You can arrange it into different stacks or shapes. You can present it visually. That looks like a bar graph, right? So often we think about telling data, we're thinking, well, put a chart, show a graph, that tells a story, but data in itself is not a story. Data can only be part of a story. And so if you actually want to explain your data, it needs to be formed. It needs to be tucked and folded within a greater story. Not only does it make it more effective, it makes it more memorable. Stories without data simply aren't compelling. Data without stories simply doesn't inspire. You have to connect the two together. And often I encourage organizations, you need to start doing this. You need to start connecting your stories and your data at the very beginning when you're collecting stories. One of the issues I see so often with organizations, first of all, is many of them don't even have a central repository where they even keep their stories. But even for those that do, oftentimes they'll write out their story. They'll get the Samantha story, they'll write it out, and it's put there, and okay, we're going to use it, and then they walk away, and they're missing a critical component. One of the things I encourage is data mapping. When you write down your story, the very first thing you should then do is, what are the data points which make this story even more compelling? What are 2 or 3 data points that reinforce why this story is effective or why this story matters? And it's an opportunity to sort through all of the data that your organization has about its impact and figure out what is most effective. And without that data mapping, How then are you going to learn how to tuck and fold your data into that story? Because one of the things I see all too often is when people do want to include data into the story, it sticks out like a sore thumb. They have this beautiful narrative, and then all of a sudden it's like slamming on the brakes when you're driving 50 miles an hour because we have a data point, and then we're going to continue the narrative. And it's jarring, and it throws people off, and it's just simply ineffective because it's not going to be remembered. So data mapping. In terms of strategy, this is one of the most effective tools I have ever found on learning how to build data and your stories together. So what makes data effective in stories? First and foremost, there's that concept of pattern interruption or cognitive dissonance. Something that makes the mind of the listener go, whoa, wait, what? Earlier in Samantha's story, again, I was up here, I heard an audible gasp, I heard the murmur from the crowd when I talked about a Braille Bible costing $800. I doubt most of you in the room were expecting that. And I just have to share personally, I'm not proud of it, but oftentimes if I'm in church or if I'm at somewhere and I'm hearing a storyteller, if somebody's coming up on stage to talk about their organization, I'm not proud of it, but a lot of times I'm already beginning to check out, right? And then if the person gets up on stage and they're talking about themselves or they're talking about the history, or the worst for me is when they throw up the PowerPoint with 16 points of data and they just start reading through it. By the time they're done, I'm done. I've checked out. But I'll tell you, if I'm watching a video or if I'm listening to a presenter and they hit me with a data point that makes me sit back and go, whoa, I wasn't expecting that, I'm now invested into their story and I'm willing to listen. So what makes data effective? First and foremost, it's something that interrupts the pattern. It creates that cognitive dissonance of something we just simply weren't expecting. It needs to be unexpected and memorable. It needs to be something that's easily remembered. If we go through statistics and there's 7 layers to that data point, are people who aren't involved in your organization likely to remember it? No. Quite frankly, people in your own organization may not be able to remember it. But if you can hit with a data point that is simple, that is unexpected, and most importantly, memorable, it's something people can carry with them as they walk away. Data also needs to encourage action. Going back to the video, 5,000 people showed up. There weren't enough surgeons. Some people had walked for over a month to get there, and thousands turned away. That data compels you to act, doesn't it? What would it take to get more surgeons on that ship? What will it take to get more resources into the hands of those doctors? What does it take to put more ships out there? The data compels you to act because you want to help solve a problem. And then finally, data has to be credible and it has to be authentic. Don't make up data. I've often heard people say, well, I have a really powerful story, but we don't have a data point that supports it. Don't make it up. It goes back to the rhetorical triangle, right? What was the top part? The ethos. It's the credibility. If you make up the data and people find out, you instantly lose that credibility and your stories simply won't be effective any longer. So you have to be able to back up the data that you share. It doesn't mean that in a direct mail appeal, when you're telling the story and you have a data point, you don't have to sit there and have a works cited page afterwards. But you have to know that if people look it up, they're going to be able to confirm what you just told them. Especially if it's something that is so shocking, they're saying, I can't believe this and I need to find it. This is what makes data effective in stories. And on the flip side, I don't have a list, but what makes data ineffective? Well, first and foremost, listing. Lists of data, right? Nothing turns off most people faster than having to sort through all the data themselves. Human brains aren't wired for data, by the way. Harvard Business Review did a study. They actually found that over 65% of our day-to-day conversation is conducted through story. The human brain is actually wired to be receptive to stories. Isn't it incredible that God actually designed our brains to be able to communicate through storytelling? In fact, in the Bible is story after story. Even Jesus spoke in parables. He spoke in story. And when you start listing data points, you've eliminated the story. Something else I see far too often in storytelling is they want to put too much data in. Oftentimes, you only need 1 or 2 key points of data to be able to effectively make your story. You don't need 10 or 15 points, 1 or 2. If it's a really long story, maybe 3. The other thing you need to do is make sure that your data is relevant. When I'm talking about Samantha's story, I put two data points that were relevant to that topic, but there were a million more I could have shared. I could have talked about 358 million people worldwide who are legally to fully blind, 95% of whom are unchurched, mostly because they can't afford Bibles, but that wouldn't have made that story more effective, right? So when you're going through the story building, you have to find data that is relevant to the story you're trying to share. And sometimes that means really good data gets left to the side, and you just simply need to find another story that can use that data instead. So again, this is meant to be a bit of a workshop activity. So we're going to walk through a few steps to help you lay the foundation and begin the process of learning how to build data into your storytelling. And the first one I'm going to ask you is to write down or to type or to think about what is one big idea for your organization. Now, this is part of StoryFind's master plan. This is a whole other topic we won't go into today. But something else I will share is when you start telling stories, you need one big idea for that story. You can't have 5 or 6 ideas combined into the story. People tune that out. So what is one big idea for your organization that you would love to share? And if you can't think of one, start with your organization's mission. That's what I was saying. What is your mission then? Make that your one big idea. But if you can, the reason I'm talking, I want to give you a moment to think about it. What is one big idea that you want to share within your organization? And then the next step, which is also so critically missed too often, which audience are you trying to reach? Are you trying to reach people who don't know who you are? Are you trying to reach your donor base, volunteer base? Are you trying to reach people who could use your resources or services? Because every audience has different data points to which they'll respond, right? When I used Samantha's story in Appeal, I knew that my target audience was my donor base, which was primarily made up of Christians over the age of 65. And so sharing Samantha's story, I realized most of the people reading it have children and grandchildren, and they were going to be imagining Samantha in place of their grandchildren. And then as grandparents, they were probably thinking, well, would I spend $800 to put a Bible into my own granddaughter's hand? What audience are you trying to reach? Because the audience determines data effectiveness. And then as you're thinking through that story, I want you to take a few moments. What are 2 or 3 effective data points for your organization which will reach this audience and which will communicate to that one big idea? What are some data points that are memorable? What are some data points that most other people in this room wouldn't even know? And I can tell you in my 20-plus years of executive leadership nonprofit experience, I have yet to find an organization that doesn't have data that is memorable and surprising. So what are some of those effective data points? And then the final question I want you to start doing right now, and this is something that takes work. How can you begin to tuck and fold those data points into the story that you want to share? How can you turn your data into narrative? And again, another foundational piece, and this is a whole other topic that I won't go into, but think about the story arc, that broad story arc. What makes an effective story? You have a struggle. In the case of Samantha, she's blind since birth. There's a challenge. She wants a Braille Bible and her family can't afford one. And then there's the success. She received a Bible and realized Easter is for her too. Well, when you're talking about tucking and folding data into the story, how do you bring the data into that overarching story arc? And help them produce an event video. And they had done events, they had done videos multiple years in a row. In the 2 prior years to StoryFind coming in, they had raised about $50,000 over the 2 years. They had about 150 total donors. Well, we produced a video that not only had the stories, but we helped them integrate the data into that story. And it turned out that on the year we had the video, they had over 360 donors, over 220 first-time donors. They raised almost twice as much money as the 2 previous years combined. And then on top of it, when they sent out follow-ups, they had almost a 52% donor conversion rate. And it was through the successful integration of story and data, which only the years before, all they had done were simply told stories. So when we talk about it, this isn't some theoretical concept. There are examples after examples after examples of when you use data in storytelling, your results are so much far greater, which allows you and your organizations and the ministries or the ministries you support to have a greater impact in the world around you. So I go back to Samantha's story because I really want to share why I'm so passionate about that one particular story. When I wrote appeals for Lutheran Braille workers, we typically would raise $40,000 to $50,000 off each appeal, which the cost for it was about $5,000. So I typically had an 8-to-1, 10-to-1 ROI, which is solid. That particular appeal, though, which, by the way, I sat on it. The mother had called me, I think it was May or maybe June. I actually sat on that story until the next year, and I didn't send it out until right before Easter, as our Easter appeal. But that appeal raised on its own in direct mail response over $150,000. But more than the actual checks coming in, it was the engagement. We knew when that letter hit mailboxes because we were getting phone calls immediately. We were getting emails. We were getting social media from some of my donors. I was getting text messages. And by the way, I had shared those data points in previous avenues, and we had talked about it before, but because of the story, it clicked in their brain. And we were getting phone calls from people saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe it costs so much money. What can we do to help more children like Samantha? Because they asked, how many people are waiting for a Bible? And at that time, the waiting list was over 140,000 people. So they said, what can we do? And it wasn't just donor response, it was also volunteer engagement. We had the most number of volunteer signups I had ever seen. We had new centers opening. The response was incredible, but it's because Samantha's story with the data points connected the brain and the heart, and it led to that call to action. But it was that final one which really stunned me. I'd been working with a donor couple since I had first started, and when I first started, they were about an $800 to $1,000 a year donor. And I had visited them because I was in the area, and I found out they had a very personal connection to visual impairment, and they had more capacity. And so over time, I worked with them, and they were over $2,000 a year donors, and they indicated they were interested in a campaign we were launching. So I had our campaign consultant talk to them, and they had self-indicated a $50,000 pledge over 5 years, $10,000 a year. And I went to visit them as a follow-up. And by the time I left, they had actually done a pledge form. They had committed to $150,000 over 5 years. The day after I left their living room, Samantha's appeal dropped, and they received it in the mailbox. And they called me, and they said, "Daniel, why didn't you share this story with us in our living room? We can't believe how much work is left to be done, and we talked about it, and we prayed about it, and we want to increase our pledge to $500,000. Largest single cash pledge in that organization's history at that time. And it was because not only is Samantha's story, but they specifically referenced the data within it. Data in storytelling is compelling, it leads to action, it increases impact. So as we near the end of our time together, just as a recap, first and foremost, data and story need to be intertwined. It needs to be tucked and folded together. Data on its own simply won't tell a story. Data is not a story. Second, data is most effective if it's surprising. If it makes you sit back and go, "Whoa, I wasn't expecting that," because it grabs people's attention and it makes them want to learn more. And then finally, data within the storytelling produces the most effective results. And so I encourage you, as you look at your stories within your organizations, go back to that mapping exercise. Identify ways of how you can use data to make your story stronger, and take and tuck and fold it all together. I'll come up later, I'll be up later this afternoon, but we do have a QR code. We want to sit there and share with anybody. We actually have an offer for foundations of storytelling. If you or somebody in your organization could use some guidance and training from Kristen on the foundation of storytelling, this QR code will give you an opportunity to sign up for one of 2 sessions that we're offering for you for free. So I'll give a second if anybody wants to grab that. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. If you want to talk about this more, if you would like to run through some ideas or get some more guidance and support on how to build your data and storytelling together, you can visit our website. You can find us on Instagram. Mike and I will be at our table. We'll be facilitating some of the round tables today. We'll be around. Please feel free to come up and talk with us. That's what we are here for. So with that being said, thank you so much for your time, and I encourage you, bring your data and storytelling together. Have a great conference.